Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing two unforgettable interactive cards. This first one here is the second card I'm going to be making. It uses a snap and spin with the frog leaping from one lily pad to the other. The second one, I'm going to use some mini action wobbles to create a super simple card, an easy card, but it has a little bit of wiggle to them and it folds nice and flat or goes nice and flat to go into an envelope. I'll be using this totally awesome birthday stamp set from Pajama Crafter Stamps. I've already used this stamp set before, so we can get right into stamping, but typically if it's a brand new stamp set, I use a white eraser on the stamping surface just to rub on the stamping surface to make sure to remove any possible manufacturing residue. It helps that stamp take ink just a little bit better. So I am going to watercolor my frogs as well as do a freehand watercolor background. So I am working with some watercolor cardstock here. I put a little bit of embossing powder tool on that cardstock before stamping it with some embossing ink, and then I'm going to heat emboss it with some embossing glaze. I like to use a Misti stamping tool when I'm doing my stamping so that I can stamp it multiple times in exactly the same spot and make sure that I get complete images. Once I have stamped it a few times, I put it on a scrap piece of paper, and I'm going to be using some peeled paint distress glaze. Distress glaze is an embossing powder. It comes in a bunch of different colors. It is transparent, so if you happen to put it on some printed paper, you'd be able to see the print underneath it. But because these are just line drawings, I'm only using it for the color. I thought using a green embossing powder for the frogs would be perfect. It would coordinate beautifully with them. You could use just a black embossing powder or even a brown embossing powder if you prefer, for those lines to stand out just a little bit more. Once I've tapped the excess off, I use my embossing tool to melt that powder. Now I'm going to create two backgrounds. I'm going to create a vertical card as well as a horizontal card. I'm using some watercolor cardstock here because I am going to be doing some freehand watercolor for my background. I'm starting by putting a little bit of color on that background. I have some tumbled glass here that I'm putting on the top 2/3 or so of that background using a large blending brush. And then for the bottom of the cardstock, I'm going to be using some cracked pistachio. It's a nice, beautiful greeny blue. It's a little bit of a different shade from what I want to use for my greenery as well as my lily pad. So I wanted to choose a color that had a green tone to it, but wasn't going to blend in with those greeneries. So I'm just doing super light blending here. Now you could even omit the freehand watercolor if you are not comfortable doing it, but I'm using some very simple shapes. It's just to add a little bit of a background that coordinates with those frogs. And I thought by doing some bulrushes and some lily pads, it was super easy and just added a little bit more interest to that background and kind of supported the frog images. So I'm starting with the greenery for my bulrushes or cattails. I start at the bottom of the leaf and just kind of flick my brush up a little bit to create that greenery. I'm using some bundled sage distress ink. For the lily pads, I'm using peeled paint distress ink. And those are pretty much oval shapes, but with a little bit of a notch out of them. So again, super simple shapes. That first lily pad that I created is a little bit darker than I would prefer it, so the rest of them are going to be a little bit on the lighter shade. Again, I wanted to create a supporting background for my frogs, but I don't necessarily want them to be too dark. I want them to be a little bit more pale, a little bit more peaceful. Once I have the scene, that part of the scene done on the first piece, I'm going to do the same thing on the second, starting at the base just to create my greenery as well as the stalks for the bulrushes or the cattails. Now the brush I'm using has water in the handle, so on my right I have a piece of paper towel that I'll be using to squeeze my brush out to flush the bristles to take on a different color. You can also use it to tap on that paper towel if you happen to have a little bit too much water in the bristles. I love this brush because it means that I don't have to have a glass of water on my desk. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I had a glass of water there's a very good chance I'd be either spilling it or drinking it. So by having the water in the handle, I find it very, very handy. And all you need is an extra piece of paper towel just to be able to flush that brush for the next color. For my bulrushes, I'm using some ground espresso distress ink, and these are actually refills for the distress pads that I'm using. I love finding more ways of using a tool. So the fact that I already had the refills to refill my distress pads, it made it even more valuable knowing that they can also be used for watercolor. And each one of those colors in that little well on my palette is I only need like a drop there and I can use it for a long time. The one thing though with this palette with the distress inks in it, those distress inks will never ever dry. So it does need to be stored horizontally. We don't want to put this vertically on a shelf or something because it will all run out. Those inks never dry. I've had this pad or this palette for many, many, many years, never had an ink dry out on there. So that's something to be cautious about, that if you haven't done this before, you want to make sure that you know. To the bottom right of each one of those colors, I have just a little label that I wrote down the color, and then I used a watercolor brush to watercolor on there. So I know exactly which color is in each well, the name as well as the color tone. It just helps me to pick the colors a little bit better. So my backgrounds here are completely done. I'm going to set them aside to dry while I work on my frogs. I'm starting by using some peeled paint distress ink. Because we have the green lines to them, they're going to coordinate perfectly with the peeled paint distress Glaze. And I'm going to be using these 3 frogs between the 2 different cards. It just makes sense to watercolor them all at once, just like watercoloring the background makes sense all at once, because they can just dry at the same time and I don't have to wait 2 times for different drying time. So that distress glaze, the lines are going to resist the ink here, so it makes it really easy for watercoloring. When you emboss for watercolor, it leaves a little bit of a ridge to it, so it means that that watercolor is not going to blend in or bleed into the color beside it, especially if you're working with opposite colors. Like I'm going to be using some barn door for the tongues, and by having that little ridge there, I can make sure that that barn door ink stays where it's supposed to, and I don't have to wait for one color to dry before working with a different color right beside it. So it makes it a little bit easier to do that watercoloring. So I'm using bundled sage for the outside, or sorry, peeled paint for the outside parts of the frogs. I'll be using some bundled sage for their bellies. I wanted a little bit of a lighter tone. If by chance you don't have 2 different colors, you can just add a little bit of extra water to the color that you're using for the outside just to get a lighter tone of it. For the inside of their mouths, I'm using some forest moss. Now I'm choosing to use some distress refills for my watercolor. You could also use watercolor pencils, watercolor crayons if you want. There's many different ways to watercolor. If by chance you only have the distress pads or a dye-based pad, you can use them on a non-porous surface, smush it down, and then add a little bit water and create some watercolors that way, or even dye-based markers. The one thing with dye-based markers though is I found that because you can't smush a whole lot of ink or scribble a whole lot of ink on a non-porous surface, you end up with really fairly pale colors because that water really dilutes the color in that. But I definitely suggest looking at what you have, and there might be something that you already have that works perfect for watercolor. I always, again, love when you can use a tool for more than what is just intended. To add a little bit of extra texture to these guys, I'm using some glossy accents on their eyes. I wanted them to have some nice glossy domed dimension to them, and I put a little bit of stickles on that birthday hat. For this particular day when I was creating these cards, I had to go out do some errands for a couple hours, so I thought it was a great time for both the watercolors to dry as well as the glossy accents. If you have a good chunk of time to do your creating, you can save that step till the cards are completely done. You don't have to do it at this point. It's just what worked for me on this particular day. And I just wanted to also share that you don't necessarily need to wait for those watercolors to dry before putting the glossy accents on there. The one thing to note though is you want, when you're using glossy accents on top of dye-based inks, you only want to put them on one color. You don't want to put them on 2 different colors that join, because those glossy ink, or the glossy accents, will rehydrate those inks and those colors will run. So once we have them dried completely, I'm using my detailed cutting scissors in order to fussy cut around the frogs. This is really the hardest part to these cards, is fussy cutting around. It's not the most simple shape, so it's a little bit more challenging to do that fussy cutting, but it's not completely impossible. You'll notice that my right hand here, because I'm right-handed holding the scissors in my right hand, pretty much stays fairly stationary. My left hand is what is moving that paper, directing it right in the blade or in the path of the scissors blade. This is the best way to do fussy cutting, using your non-dominant hand to move the paper in the direction or in the way of the scissors blade. You don't want to be moving your scissors hand in all directions for doing that fussy cutting, this is the best way to do it. So once we have this fussy cut, I will do the other two as well as the birthday hat off screen. It's exactly the same as these, just a slightly different shape. When I'm doing this, I am doing my fussy cutting right outside of the line so we don't have a white halo. You can, if you prefer, put a white halo around your fussy cut images. It just really depends on the look that you're going for. The one thing to do though when you're doing it with a white halo is try to make sure that that halo is even all the way around your image. That's the way that it looks best. So with our frogs done in fussy cut as well as our backgrounds dry, we can start creating our cards. So I'm going to use the vertical one first. I'm trimming it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Then it's going to have a brown mat behind it that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. That's going to work well with the bulrushes. Now I wanted there to be a little bit more ink blending on my background, so I'm using some broken china for the sky and evergreen bough for around the water. I prefer when creating cards to have a little bit darker around the outside edges. I just think it frames it in a little bit more, makes it a little bit more interesting in my opinion. So that's why I wanted to add that extra little bit of ink blending. I want to do a sentiment on here, and the Totally Awesome Birthday Stamp Set has some fantastic sentiments that can be combined to create a bunch of different phrases. And I love the fact that there's a bunch of different individual words that you can use to create with. Now, I created a interactive card for the Pear Blossom Press channel that I use this stamp set to create sentiments for. So if you're looking for more sentiment options or more ways of using this stamp set for different sentiments, check out that video. I've collaborated with it, so it should be visible on my channel, but I'll put a link to it in the comments. But another way to use this with some die cuts, because I didn't use the frog images for that card, I used die cuts, but I absolutely loved all of the sentiments in this set, and they worked perfectly for the theme of that card. Now for the sentiment for this card, I wanted it to be prominent on the background and have a different texture to it. So I used some VersaMark ink to stamp that sentiment, and then I poured some Walnut Stain Distress Glaze on there. This way it has some glossy dome dimension and it's a different finish than the background. Now you might have noticed that the embossing powder stuck around the outside edges of this card. That's because I had just done that ink blending and it hadn't quite dried yet. Using a soft brush to brush that off is the way to completely fix that. Or wait a while for it to dry or use a heat tool to dry it, but this worked perfectly. Now to add a little bit of extra shimmer to that background, I used some sparkle splatter effects to splatter on that background. It just gives it a little bit of shimmer. Another option would be to use the brush from that and brush it onto the water so that you have the shimmer in a certain area, but I really liked the splatter on the background. To create the action with these frogs, I'm using some mini action wobbles. I'm doing both of them with the mini action wobbles. You could, if you'd want, only have one of them with that action to it and have the other one glued down flat, but these guys are both just so adorable, and I thought it was perfect with that sentiment because it says stay unforgettable, and I thought having the action for both frogs was perfect with that. So here we have our card. It's totally done. Like I said, the hardest part is fussy cutting those frogs. The rest of it comes together really quickly and easily, and then you have to wait a little bit for paint to dry. And those frogs have just so much character to them. And I love the supportive background. It works perfectly with the frogs, but I don't think it takes the attention away from them. For the second card, I'm trimming it once again to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm doing the extra ink blending around the outside edges. Just like the first one, I want to make sure that the outside edges are a little bit darker than the center. Just frame it in a little bit more. Again, I have a piece of black cardstock that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for the mat for this one. For this card, I'm going to be using the leftover frog with the slide and spin die set, and I'm going to create a channel so that that frog can spin and flip from one lily pad to the other. So when I was doing my watercoloring for this, I was paying attention to how far apart those lily pads were because I wanted to make sure that that die was going to work perfectly with this. I taped that die in place with some Best Ever craft tape to make sure it wasn't going to move on me while I'm doing my die cutting. And that piece that gets die cut out, we're saving it. We're going to glue it onto the mat right where that channel is. So when we look at that card head on, it looks like a complete image in the back. We don't have a semicircle there that is brown behind it. I always like to try to hide that as much as possible. So I'm going to stamp a sentiment on the front here. This one is going to say jump for joy, and I thought this one worked perfectly with the spinner channel that he's going to be jumping from one to the other. The rest of my sentiment I'll put on the inside of my card. So I once again put a little bit of embossing powder tool on my background. I stamped it with that VersaMark ink, and I'm also going to be heat embossing this with that Walnut Stain Distress Glaze. I think it just works perfectly on that background. It coordinates with those bulrushes, but it also stands out against the background, our little watercolored lilies or watercolored lily pads and bulrushes. So once that's done, I'm going to add that splatter to the background because I really love how it looked on the first card. I think it just adds something interesting, something for the light to catch. But because it's the light colored sparkle splatter accents or effects, it doesn't take anything away from that background. So while waiting for that splatter to dry, I'm going to stamp my sentiment on the inside of the card. I have it lined up in my Misti, and I'm using some broken china. This is the color that I used to do the ink blending around the outside of the front part of the card. It's nice and bright. You could also use VersaMark ink and heat emboss if you want. I tend not to heat emboss on the inside of the cards, but you easily could do that if you wanted it to coordinate with the sentiment on the front. So with all of our pieces ready to go, I'm going to put the mat on the front of the card first. Then I'm going to line up the image piece on the front, but not glue it down. It's just to position that inside channel. I'm going to add the glue to the inside channel. You want to make sure that it actually sticks down before you start to move it. As you can see, I moved it a little bit too soon. Now, before we add that front to the card, I'm going to use the snap and spin to add our frog to the front or in that channel. I have that snap and spin in there. It just snaps together. It's super easy to use. And I used a sticky spot in order to glue the frog to it, and then obviously check and make sure that everything is spinning and moving properly. I'm using some double thick foam tape here for the back. You want to make sure that your foam tape is thick enough so that that snap and spin has room to move. And as I'm putting it on the back of my card front there, I'm also making sure that I'm not putting this foam tape too close to that channel. I want to make sure that that has plenty of room to move and that my tape is not going to infringe on that in any way. Now, if you don't happen to have double thick foam tape, and I'll link it in the description as well as all the other supplies that I'm using for these cards, you could also use regular thickness of foam tape, but you would want to double that to make sure that you have enough of that space. So once we have that on there, and I've tested to make sure that that doesn't infringe on my snap and spin in any way, I take the backing off and then add that to the front of the card, and we have this adorable card with the frog leaping from one lily pad to the other. The one thing I realized at this point that I forgot though is I hadn't glued the hat on the frog, and I wanted to have him to have that little birthday hat there. So I just used my Barely Art glue and stuck it behind the head of the frog, held it in place for a few moments just to make sure that that glue had time to set. And here is the finished result. I think it's just fun to create interactive cards because they have that little bit of a wow factor to them. This one, again, super simple and easy to do. The thing that took the longest was doing that fussy cutting, but I think it's totally worth it because of the final result. Then we have our first card here with those action wobbles. Again, super quick and simple to do, but those frogs have that wonderful movement to them. They will go completely flat, so they'll sit into a regular envelope. You don't need any extra dimension for that particular one. And I love how it gives them that little bit of wiggle, that little bit of spring to them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.